here as a temporary member of the U.S. delegation to the First Committee working on nuclear disarmament. And along with that onerous and difficult job came the opportunity to attend staff meetings at the U.S. mission to the United Nations, led personally by Adlai Stevenson, with Eleanor Roosevelt sitting at his right hand. A formidable team, one whose work was always interesting and inspiring to watch, and a wonderful learning opportunity for someone who aspired perhaps partway up that ladder, but never guessed that he himself would be sitting in the same seat some years later with all of those opportunities, indeed challenges, here at the United Nations before me. Secondly, I want to say that as we look at Adlai Stevenson's legacy and as we look ahead, I'd like to say just a few words about something that has been on my mind for some time, and indeed, probably unknown to the State Department. I gave a speech at a small gathering here in New York about it some years ago while I was representing the United States at the United Nations, and that's the future of the veto in the Security Council. This is not an issue that any American, Alec Wolf will be sure to tell you, who's working in an official position would find it light and easy to speak about. It is one of those sacred cows that remains untouchable. But I have had a long feeling that we need to begin to think more creatively about the veto and its use. And some years ago, I had the pleasure of proposing, and repeat whenever I have an opportunity to do so, and that is now, the hope that the permanent members of the Security Council can, in coming time, find an opportunity to find a way, working together to qualify the use of the veto, and I would begin particularly in cases where the Security Council is seized of the question of genocide. There is no more important issue to bring us together, the 5 permanent members, than dealing with genocide. And my proposal has always been that the permanent 5 arrange for a voting convention between them, where that if 3 of them were to oppose the text before the Council, they would agree to the exercise of a veto. But less than 3, they would continue to attempt to work the text themselves, but if they had to, abstain rather than vote against it in the end, because it is so important to the future of mankind and indeed humanity, that we find a way effectively to work in the Security Council to react more rapidly, more positively, and in some cases much more vigorously to cases where genocide is the central issue before mankind, and the Council is working on it. If this were to work, one could think, obviously, of enlarging the sphere. Non-proliferation, as Alex Wolf said, might be one of those issues where a similar convention could apply, and indeed aggression by one state against another, which was clearly seen, as we saw in the case of Iraq against Kuwait those many years ago here in this building, could provide that kind of opportunity. Would Adlai Stevenson have supported and proposed this? I don't know. But as a man of principle, I suspect an idea along these lines might have tantalized him, and indeed might have even caused him to find an opportunity, as he often did, not to be bound so much by his instructions, but by his inspiration, not to be lassoed and tied down to formal positions, but to find those ways in his marvelous presentations to tweak the interest of mankind, and indeed even to challenge the thinking back in Washington, something that U.S. representatives to the United Nations are paid good money to do, in my view. Well, those are my thoughts. I think they would be part of the legacy if we think enough about it. And anyone who has had an opportunity to read, as I have and others here, about Adlai Stevenson's legacy might well feel the same. Now I'm going to move ahead as moderator and bring up the members of the panel to speak to you about what's on their mind. And in typical UN fashion, there is no special protocol here at this table. We will take the individuals in alphabetical order. And John Bradamus comes first on my list, and so it is my special pleasure John, just to say a few words about you and then ask if you will speak to us too for a few minutes about Adlai Stevenson and his lasting legacy. John Bradamus is President Emeritus of New York University. He led the transition of New York University from a commuter institution to a national and indeed international research university. In 1955 and 1956, he was executive assistant to Adlai Stevenson, in charge of research during Stevenson's second presidential campaign. An Indiana Democrat, Dr. Bradamus has served as U.S. representative in the Congress for 22 years, and for the last 4 years as the House Majority Whip. John, it's a pleasure always to have you here, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. I'm honored to have been invited to take part in the discussion of this book about one of the modern heroes of our country, and I want to pay my respects to Judge Alvin Liebling, editor of the book and the dedicated public servant who's brought us together today. I am, of course, as I'm sure we all are, pleased to greet Judge Liebling, former United States Senator Adlai Stevenson, Felicity Yost of the UN, my Oxford University contemporary, Professor Richard Gardner, Brian Urquhart, another friend of many years, Bill Vanden Heuvel, and of course Ambassador Pickering and Ambassador Miller. Please allow me to explain my connection to the man whose life and legacy have brought us together today. In 1952, while a student at Oxford University, on the eve of the presidential election in the United States that year, I joined several other Americans to put on a mock national convention at Rhodes House in Oxford, where I nominated Adlai Ewing Stevenson as the Democratic Party candidate for President of the United States. And I also wrote for a student journal in Oxford an essay entitled Why I'm Voting Democratic in November, in which I sharply criticized the candidacy of Dwight Eisenhower, praised Stevenson, and went so far as to protect the Democratic victory. And so politically intense was I, and so greatly did I admire Stevenson, that I had reprints of my article made and sent to, among others, William McCormick Blair, Jr., the Chicago attorney, Stevenson law partner, and close associate. Only months after leaving Oxford in the summer of '73 and going back home to South Bend, Indiana, I became the Democratic Party nominee for election to the House of Representatives in '54. On September 18, '54, I attended a dinner in Indianapolis to kick off the Democratic congressional campaign, took a tape recorder with me, secured endorsements for use by Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn, and the titular leader of the Democratic Party, Adlai Stevenson, who was accompanied by Bill Blair. I lost my first race for Congress with 49.5% of the total vote to the incumbent Republican. Obviously, I decided to run again in '56, but I thought it prudent to get some experience in Washington, and so I worked on the staffs of a senator and a congressman. And several months later, Bill Blair telephoned me from Chicago, recalling my early enthusiasm for Adlai Stevenson, said the governor was going to run again in '56 and asked me to come to Chicago to help. And as you've been told, I was put in charge of research on issues, an assignment that led to one of the most fascinating and valuable years of my life. I served on the Stevenson staff from the summer of '55 through the August '56 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, then went back home to South Bend, ran my own campaign for Congress. Such was the attractiveness of President Eisenhower at the top of the Republican ticket. He defeated Stevenson by a larger margin in '56 and '52, and I was also caught in the Eisenhower sweep, and I thought, well, Bradamus, here you are. You're not yet 30 years old and twice defeated for Congress. You're a has-been before you started. It was not until my third campaign in '58, a year when Democrats gained 49 new seats in the House, that I was first elected, then 10 times reelected. In Congress, I was author in the Stevenson tradition of the International Education Act, which provided federal funds to colleges and universities for the study of other countries. In my campaign for a 12th term, I was defeated in Reagan's landslide victory over President Carter, and shortly thereafter was invited to become president of New York University, in which position I served until 1992, when I became president emeritus, my present responsibility. And at NYU, I took Stevenson's example of leadership as a model. We now have a center at NYU, which bears my name, for the study of Congress as a policy-making center. Central to our understanding of the career of Adlai Stevenson was his focus on the indispensable place in the conduct of American foreign policy of diplomacy. And his career at the United Nations is the most obvious example of that commitment. As I noted in my contribution to Judge Liebling's book, Stevenson was engaged with the United Nations from the start, having been involved with the preparations for the founding conference in '45 in San Francisco, where he was spokesman for the U.S. delegation, and in 1960 he was appointed U.S. ambassador to the UN by President Kennedy. I add that in the summer of '49, following my graduation from Harvard, I served at Lake Success by appointment of the State Department as an intern at the UN in the section for non-governmental organizations. The Secretary General then, to remind you, was Trygve Lie. And I add that one of my first acts as a freshman congressman after my election in '58 concerned appropriations for foreign aid, and I drafted a letter and got the signatures of 50 House Democrats to President Eisenhower saying, "You're a Republican, we're Democrats, but we want to assure you we support your foreign aid proposal." When I, in '81, became president of NYU, I continued that Stevensonian commitment to international studies. I established a Center for Japan, U.S. Business and Economic Studies, the Casa Italiana Zerilli Marimo, the Skirball Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies, the Remark Institute of European Studies, the Alexander S. Onassis Program of Hellenic Studies, and the King Juan Carlos of Spain Center for the Study of Modern Spain. And as we meet only a few months after the death of another American political leader who was able to bring together people of various views to solve tough problems, Senator Edward M. Kennedy, we're reminded that crucial to the solution of such problems, whether foreign or domestic, is diplomacy. That was the message of Adlai Stevenson. And as we see the challenges our country faces today in Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, North Korea, all the more do we as a nation need to employ the commitment to and skills for diplomacy embodied in the career of Adlai Stevenson. Here, I think it fair to note that both President Obama and Secretary of State Clinton have demonstrated that same conviction, same belief in the indispensable place of diplomacy in the conduct of American foreign policy. To make such a statement may sound like a truism, but when we look at events in our foreign affairs in recent years, I find such a shift not only refreshing and encouraging, but enormously consequential. If I were still in the House of Representatives, I would say, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you again, John, very much for your interesting and indeed very, very helpful words. It's next my pleasure to introduce Ambassador Richard Gardner, Professor of Law and International Organizations at Columbia Law School and Senior Counsel to Morgan Lewis. Richard served as U.S. Ambassador to Italy from 1997 to '81 and U.S. Ambassador to Spain from 1993 to 1997 with great distinction. Previous to that, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs, I think precisely at the time that Governor Stevenson was here. In 2000, he was a public delegate to the 55th Millennium United Nations General Assembly and served as Special Advisor to the UN at the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio, as he did in 1972 to the UN Conference on the Human Environment. Ambassador Gardner.
Thank you, Tom. It's very meaningful for me to take part in this symposium and to talk specifically, as I have been asked to do, about Adlai's very specific contributions during his 4 years here at the United Nations. I'm happy to do this because I think I'm the last surviving member of Adlai's UN team. I say that with great sadness. It was quite a team. His deputy was Francis Plimpton, a great personality. His number 3 was Charles Yost, a great career ambassador who went on to become ambassador of the United Nations, to the United Nations himself. Phil Klutznick of Chicago was our ECOSOC representative, and Jack Bingham and Sid Yates rounded out the ambassadorial team here at UN. It was a remarkable group of individuals. And Adlai was very concerned to have the right team in the State Department because he knew that he would be under instructions and be influenced profoundly by what came from the Department of State. And so he chose personally Harlan Cleveland, a great public servant, to be the Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs. And I was very privileged because Harlan chose me to be one of his deputies. The other was Joe Sisko, who sadly passed away several years ago. And we had a great team including Bill Buffum, who many of you may remember, who came up